From the moment we develop the capacity for independent thought, we're confronted with a puzzling contradiction. In every other domain of human knowledge, science, history, philosophy, art, we're taught that understanding evolves, interpretations differ, and certainty remains elusive. Scientists revise theories when new evidence emerges. Historians reinterpret events as new perspectives arise. Philosophers question their own assumptions. Artists challenge established forms. In these realms, the very essence of intellectual integrity lies in recognizing the provisional nature of knowledge, the understanding that our grasp of truth evolves through continuous questioning, revision, and refinement. Doubt isn't merely permitted but essential to the advancement of human understanding. Yet within religious institutions, particularly Christianity, we encounter something radically different: the claim to possess absolute unchanging truth, immune to question or revision. The Church presents itself not as one interpreter among many, but as the authorized voice of God Himself, offering certainties where others can provide only tentative conclusions. This exceptional claim appears across denominations. Catholics cite papal infallibility and church tradition. Protestants appeal to biblical inerrancy. Evangelicals claim direct guidance from the Holy Spirit. Despite their differences, each shares the fundamental assumption that absolute religious truth exists and that they have privileged access to it. This curious exception to the provisional nature of human knowledge raises a profound question. How could one institution claim exemption from the uncertainties that characterize all other domains of human understanding? Even more puzzling is the psychological state this claim produces in believers. The same person who recognizes the evolving nature of scientific understanding or the interpretive nature of historical knowledge often maintains absolute certainty about religious claims that, by their very nature, should be less verifiable than empirical observations. This compartmentalization, where critical thinking applies to every domain except religious truth, suggests something beyond simple belief. It points toward a sophisticated psychological mechanism capable of suspending the normal epistemological caution that operates in other realms of knowledge. Most revealing is how religious institutions respond to questioning of their truth claims. While scientific theories welcome challenge as opportunity for refinement, and philosophical positions thrive on critical examination, religious doctrines uniquely transform doubt from intellectual virtue to moral failing, from necessary tool of understanding to sin against God Himself. This inversion, where the very questioning that advances knowledge in other domains becomes spiritually dangerous in religion, suggests something more complex than ordinary truth-seeking. It indicates a system where claims to truth serve functions beyond mere accuracy, functions related to authority, psychological certainty, and institutional power. A 19th-century philosopher, raised in devout Protestantism before turning his analytical skills against Christianity, developed a revolutionary perspective that might explain this anomaly. His insight wasn't merely that religious claims might be factually questionable, but that religion's very concept of truth fundamentally inverted the relationship between knowledge and certainty, creating a system where conviction preceded evidence, belief preceded understanding, and questioning became not the path to truth, but its greatest enemy. This analysis wasn't driven by mere hostility toward religion, but emerged from profound recognition of how claims to absolute truth function psychologically and institutionally. What if the Church's claim to absolute truth isn't simply one perspective among many, but a sophisticated mechanism for controlling thought itself? What if religious certainty represents not the discovery of truth, but its replacement with a simulation designed to prevent, rather than facilitate, genuine questioning? And what if the greatest threat to authentic spiritual and intellectual development isn't doubt, but the very certainty that religion presents as spiritual virtue? The implications would transform not just how we understand religious institutions, but how we conceptualize truth itself and its relationship to psychological freedom. I invite you to consider a perspective so radical that it questions not just particular religious doctrines, but the very framework through which religion has defined truth for 2,000 years. Let's examine a curious phenomenon that appears whenever religious truth claims are questioned. A pattern so consistent yet so overlooked that it suggests something fundamental about how religious certainty functions. When scientific theories face challenge, they respond with evidence, revision, or refined methodology. When historical interpretations meet criticism, they engage with primary sources and alternative perspectives. But when religious doctrines encounter questioning, they uniquely respond not with evidence but with appeals to authority, warnings about the spiritual dangers of doubt, and assertions that certain questions should not be asked at all. This anomalous response pattern appears across theological variations and historical periods, suggesting something beyond ordinary truth-seeking. Consider how religious institutions handle textual contradictions. When historical documents contain inconsistencies, historians naturally develop interpretive frameworks acknowledging these tensions. Yet when biblical texts present contradictions, different creation accounts, varying resurrection narratives, inconsistent genealogies, religious authorities respond with elaborate harmonization efforts that would never be accepted in other textual disciplines. Rather than acknowledging the natural variations that occur in human texts, religious interpretation uniquely treats contradictions as only apparent, never actual, as puzzles requiring solution rather than natural features requiring acknowledgement. This exceptional approach to textual evidence suggests that something beyond ordinary historical understanding is at stake. This pattern extends to how religious institutions approach scientific discoveries that challenge traditional beliefs. When Galileo presented evidence for heliocentrism, the Church responded not by examining his observations, but by asserting its authority to determine astronomical truth, claiming that Scripture provided certainty where science could offer only theories. This wasn't an isolated historical incident, but represents a recurring pattern. From Darwin's evolutionary theory to modern genetics, from geological evidence of Earth's age to neurological research on consciousness, religious institutions consistently respond to scientific challenges not by revising their understanding, but by reasserting their certainty. This exceptional resistance to revision suggests that religious truth claims serve functions beyond accuracy. Perhaps most telling is how religious certainty affects psychological development. In other knowledge domains, intellectual maturity involves increasing comfort with complexity, ambiguity, and the provisional nature of understanding. Yet religious formation often moves in opposite direction, from childhood questioning toward adult certainty, from natural curiosity toward fixed doctrine, from exploration toward settlement. This psychological inversion, where maturity means greater certainty rather than greater comfort with uncertainty, appears consistently across diverse religious traditions. The pattern suggests that religious truth serves psychological functions related to certainty rather than the intellectual functions of ordinary truth-seeking. Most revealing is the concept of heresy itself, the unique religious innovation that transforms intellectual disagreement into moral transgression. In philosophy, opposing viewpoints remain philosophical positions to be debated. In science, contrary theories remain scientific hypotheses to be tested. Only in religion does intellectual difference become moral failure, a sin requiring not just correction, but condemnation. This exceptional criminalization of alternative viewpoints suggests that religious truth operates through fundamentally different mechanisms than other forms of human knowledge. Mechanisms where power and authority play central roles that would be considered inappropriate in ordinary intellectual inquiry. These anomalies point toward a disturbing possibility. What if religious truth isn't simply one form of knowledge among many, but a sophisticated simulation of knowledge designed primarily to establish certainty and authority rather than facilitate understanding? What if the Church's claim to absolute truth represents not the culmination of human knowing, but its systematic replacement with a psychological and institutional substitute that provides certainty where genuine knowledge would necessarily remain provisional? And what philosopher saw this pattern with such clarity that his analysis has been systematically misrepresented by religious authorities for over a century? In the autumn of 1887, Friedrich Nietzsche was developing ideas that would culminate in his provocative work, The Antichrist. His health was deteriorating. Blinding migraines, severe digestive problems, and failing eyesight had already forced him from his university position years earlier. Working in solitude, facing both physical suffering and growing poverty, Nietzsche formulated his most radical analysis of how religious truth functions. an analysis emerging not from abstract theorizing, but from intimate understanding of Christianity from within its tradition. What positioned Nietzsche uniquely to see what others couldn't was his unusual personal and intellectual journey. Raised in extraordinary religious devotion, his father and both grandfathers were Lutheran pastors. He had experienced firsthand the psychological power of religious certainty. Yet his training in classical philology, the meticulous historical analysis of ancient texts, gave him rare insight into how religious doctrines evolved through historical processes rather than divine revelation. This combination of religious immersion and philological expertise allowed him to recognize patterns in how religious truth claims functioned that others either missed entirely or lacked the intellectual courage to articulate. During this period of intense creativity amid physical suffering, Nietzsche contemplated a question few had asked with such radical directness. What if the very concept of religious truth represents not the highest form of knowledge, but a fundamental inversion of how understanding actually develops? Rather than focusing primarily on whether specific religious claims were factually accurate, he examined the psychological and institutional functions of religious certainty itself, how it operated within human consciousness and social structures regardless of its factual status. This approach led to a revolutionary insight. Religious truth might function primarily to establish psychological security and institutional authority rather than facilitate genuine understanding. In his notebooks from this period, Nietzsche wrote, "The will to truth that still seduces us to take so many risks, this famous truthfulness of which all philosophers have spoken with reverence, what questions this will to truth has already set before us." This wasn't mere skepticism, but profound recognition that the very concept of truth in religious contexts might serve functions beyond accuracy, creating what he called the pathos of truth, where psychological conviction and institutional authority mattered more than genuine inquiry. For Nietzsche, religious truth wasn't simply one perspective among many, but a system specifically designed to end the questioning that genuine understanding requires. What distinguished Nietzsche's analysis from mere atheistic critique was his recognition of the psychological sophistication with which religious truth operates. During his solitary walks through European mountain landscapes, he developed what he called his psychology of religion, an understanding of how religious certainty created specific states of consciousness, characterized by what he termed the will to ignorance. This wasn't simple deception, but something more complex, a psychological system where doubt became not just intellectually questionable but morally corrupt, where certainty became not just cognitively comfortable but spiritually virtuous, and where questioning itself became not the path to understanding, but evidence of sinful pride. In his personal letters from this period, Nietzsche described his goal not as destroying faith, but exposing how religious concepts of truth functioned. It is not a matter of proving that God does not exist. It is a matter of exposing how the very concept of religious truth inverts the relationship between knowledge and certainty, creating psychological and institutional mechanisms where conviction precedes evidence rather than follows from it. This wasn't attack on individual believers, but analysis of how religious frameworks transform the very process through which humans relate to knowledge itself. As Nietzsche worked through these insights amid increasing physical suffering and approaching mental collapse, he was developing an analysis that wouldn't merely question particular religious doctrines, but would expose the fundamental inversion through which religion had redefined truth itself, transforming it from outcome of questioning into barrier against the very questioning that genuine understanding requires. What if the Church's greatest innovation wasn't particular doctrines, but the very concept of truth as something requiring submission rather than continuous questioning? Nietzsche's first compelling evidence appears in his analysis of how the concept of truth evolved in religious contexts. In Beyond Good and Evil, he meticulously documents how Christianity transformed truth from process of discovery to fixed possession, from something humans pursue through continuous questioning to something the Church already possessed and believers merely received. This wasn't random historical development, but systematic inversion, converting the natural relationship between questioning and understanding into an unnatural system where questioning itself became obstacle to truth rather than its path. Consider the historical evidence. Early Christian communities displayed remarkable diversity of belief, with multiple interpretations of Jesus' significance coexisting within the emerging movement. Yet within centuries, this plurality had been replaced by rigid doctrinal standards, enforced through both ecclesiastical authority and imperial power. Nietzsche documented how concepts like heresy and orthodoxy emerged not from Jesus' teaching, but from institutional needs to establish certainty and control, creating a system where questioning became not intellectual virtue, but spiritual crime. This historical transformation reveals not natural knowledge development, but deliberate reframing of truth itself as something requiring submission rather than examination. The evidence extends beyond historical development to linguistic analysis. Nietzsche observed how religious language systematically pairs truth-related terms with submission-related concepts, accepting truth, receiving revelation, submitting to doctrine, obeying God's word. This consistent linguistic pattern contrasts sharply with knowledge terminology in other domains, where active verbs predominate, discovering evidence, testing hypotheses, evaluating claims, questioning assumptions. This linguistic difference isn't coincidental, but reveals fundamentally different relationships to knowledge, one based on active inquiry, the other on passive reception. The religious framing effectively transforms truth from outcome of questioning to substitute for questioning itself. Literary evidence provides another layer of confirmation. Analyzing religious conversion narratives across centuries, Nietzsche identified a consistent psychological pattern. Intellectual questioning gives way to certainty experienced as liberation from questioning itself. From Augustine's Confessions to modern testimonials, conversion typically involves not finding answers to specific questions, but discovering psychological relief from the burden of questioning altogether. This recurring pattern suggests that religious truth functions not primarily to satisfy intellectual inquiry, but to end it, providing psychological certainty where genuine knowledge would necessarily remain provisional. Perhaps most revealing is how Christianity transformed Jesus himself from questioner to source of unquestionable doctrine. Nietzsche observed that the historical Jesus consistently challenged religious certainties, questioned scriptural interpretations, and prioritized direct experience over inherited doctrines. Yet Christianity systematically inverted this approach, using Jesus' authority to establish exactly the kind of unquestionable doctrinal system he had challenged. This fundamental reversal, where the great questioner of religious certainties became the justification for new religious certainties, provides compelling evidence that something beyond ordinary truth-seeking was operating in Christianity's development. All these evidence streams converge on a revolutionary conclusion. Religious truth functions fundamentally differently from other forms of human knowledge, serving primarily to establish psychological certainty and institutional authority rather than facilitate genuine understanding. This doesn't necessarily mean religious claims are factually false, but that truth in religious contexts operates through different mechanisms than in ordinary knowledge domains. Mechanisms designed to end rather than advance the questioning that genuine understanding requires. If Nietzsche is correct, then religious certainty represents not the discovery of truth, but its replacement with a psychological and institutional substitute that provides comfort and stability precisely by preventing the continuous questioning that authentic knowledge development requires. The question isn't whether religious teachings provide meaning, they undeniably do, but whether their concept of truth fundamentally inverts the relationship between questioning and understanding that characterizes genuine knowledge in all other domains. To understand how religious truth functions as barrier against questioning rather than its outcome, we must examine what Nietzsche called the psychology of certainty. This psychological mechanism begins not with evidence evaluation, but with the basic human discomfort with uncertainty, the anxiety that accompanies not knowing, the psychological vulnerability that open questions create. Religious truth addresses this discomfort not by resolving specific questions through evidence, but by providing psychological framework where certainty precedes and prevents questioning itself. This isn't ordinary knowledge, but sophisticated psychological substitute that delivers certainty's comfort while bypassing the intellectual processes genuine knowledge requires. This certainty system operates through several psychological mechanisms that Nietzsche identified with remarkable precision. First comes what he called the will to ignorance, the desire for psychological security that certainty provides, even at cost of accurate understanding. Next operates the sanctification of convictions, the transformation of psychological belief states into moral virtues, where being certain becomes spiritually superior to maintaining appropriate intellectual caution. Then follows the criminalization of doubt, the inversion where questioning becomes not intellectual tool but moral failing, not path to understanding but obstacle to truth itself. The final mechanism involves the reversal of epistemic virtue, where intellectual surrender replaces critical engagement as the appropriate stance toward truth claims. Nietzsche documented these psychological mechanisms in religious texts with extraordinary detail. From Paul's epistles celebrating the foolishness of God as wiser than human wisdom, to Augustine's, "I believe so that I may understand, not understanding so that he might believe." From Tertullian's, "I believe because it is absurd," to Luther's, "Reason is the devil's whore." Christian traditions consistently invert natural epistemic relationships, placing belief before understanding, certainty before evidence, conviction before questioning. This consistent pattern reveals not random variation but systematic psychological framework, where truth functions primarily to establish certainty rather than develop understanding. The evidence becomes even more compelling when examining how religions respond to specific challenges to their truth claims. Nietzsche observed that when scientific discoveries contradicted biblical accounts, religious authorities typically responded not by revising their understanding, but by asserting their authority to determine truth, claiming special knowledge that transcended ordinary evidence standards. This wasn't occasional defensive reaction, but systematic approach to knowledge itself, creating separate epistemic domain where normal standards of evidence and revision didn't apply. The pattern suggests that religious truth serves institutional functions beyond accuracy, maintaining authority systems that would collapse if subjected to ordinary epistemic standards. Modern psychological research has substantially confirmed Nietzsche's insights. Studies consistently show that religious certainty correlates with specific cognitive patterns: lower tolerance for ambiguity, stronger need for cognitive closure, greater resistance to evidence challenging existing beliefs. These psychological correlations support Nietzsche's understanding that religious truth operates through different cognitive mechanisms than ordinary knowledge, mechanisms driven more by psychological need for certainty than intellectual commitment to accurate understanding regardless of comfort. What's particularly significant about this evidence is how it explains both religion's psychological appeal and its resistance to ordinary intellectual examination. If religious truth functions primarily to provide psychological certainty, where genuine knowledge would necessarily remain provisional, we would expect precisely the pattern we observe: powerful psychological attachment to religious certainties alongside exceptional resistance to evidence or arguments that might threaten these certainties. This psychological function explains why religious convictions respond differently to challenges than ordinary knowledge claims. They serve different primary functions, with accuracy secondary to certainty and psychological security. Nietzsche's analysis reveals that what makes religious truth exceptional isn't its superior accuracy, but its psychological sophistication, its ability to provide certainty's comfort while bypassing the intellectual processes genuine understanding requires. By recognizing this psychological function, we gain new perspective on why religious claims remain compelling despite challenges from historical, scientific, and philosophical inquiry. They address psychological needs that ordinary knowledge processes, with their inevitable uncertainties, cannot satisfy in the same way. The question isn't whether religious certainty provides comfort, but whether this comfort comes at cost of the continuous questioning that genuine understanding requires. As we assemble the evidence, a consistent pattern emerges that Nietzsche articulated in The Gay Science, but that has been systematically misinterpreted by religious authorities. What he called the true world finally becomes a fable isn't attack on particular religious doctrines, but recognition of how religion transformed the very concept of truth, creating separate epistemic category where normal knowledge processes no longer applied. This pattern appears across theological variations, historical periods, and denominational differences, suggesting something fundamental about how religious truth functions, regardless of its specific content. The pattern begins with how religion separates truth from methodology. In every other knowledge domain, truth emerges through specific methods: scientific observation and testing, historical source analysis, philosophical argument evaluation. The method's reliability determines the knowledge claim's validity. Yet religion uniquely separates truth from method, claiming knowledge while exempting its claims from the methodological scrutiny all other knowledge domains require. Whether through appeals to revelation, tradition, or spiritual insight, religious truth claims consistently bypass rather than enhance the methodological processes through which humans normally distinguish accurate from inaccurate understanding. This methodological exceptionalism appears across traditions, suggesting something fundamental about how religious truth functions. At the epistemological level, the pattern continues with what Nietzsche called the inversion of knowing. Ordinary knowledge develops from questioning toward provisional understanding, with certainty proportional to evidence quality. Yet religious epistemology inverts this relationship, beginning with certainty and working backward to selectively interpret evidence that supports pre-existing convictions while explaining away contradictory data. This epistemological reversal serves specific functions: maintaining psychological security against uncertainty, establishing institutional authority over knowledge domains, and preventing the continuous questioning that might threaten existing power structures. The pattern appears with such consistency that it suggests design rather than coincidence, a deliberate framework where truth serves authority rather than understanding. The historical pattern reveals itself in how religion responds to advancing knowledge in other domains. Nietzsche documented how consistently religious institutions initially resisted scientific, historical, and philosophical developments that challenged traditional teachings. From astronomical discoveries to evolutionary theory, from historical critical biblical analysis to philosophical examinations of religious concepts. This resistance followed predictable stages: initial condemnation of new knowledge as heretical, subsequent attempts to harmonize it with religious teaching when resistance proved futile, and eventual reinterpretation of religion itself to accommodate what could no longer be denied. This consistent pattern of reactionary adaptation suggests a system where truth serves institutional stability rather than intellectual integrity, preserving authority by whatever epistemic adjustments prove necessary. Perhaps most revealing is the pattern Nietzsche identified in how religion treats knowledge hierarchies. While other domains evaluate claims based on evidence quality regardless of source, religion consistently establishes authority-based knowledge hierarchies, where truth depends more on who speaks than what evidence they provide. From papal infallibility to scriptural inerrancy, from apostolic succession to prophetic authority, religious systems consistently create frameworks where certain sources cannot be questioned without moral transgression. This authority-based epistemology fundamentally inverts ordinary knowledge processes, where even the most respected sources remain open to critical examination. The pattern suggests a system designed primarily for control rather than understanding, using truth claims to establish power rather than advance knowledge. The pattern extends to how religion approaches intellectual development itself. Nietzsche observed that while other knowledge domains measure intellectual maturity by increasing capacity for independent critical thinking, religion uniquely measures it by growing certainty and submission to established doctrine. This developmental inversion, where intellectual maturity means greater deference to authority rather than greater capacity for independent evaluation, appears across diverse traditions. From catechetical education to seminary training, from Bible studies to theological formation, religious intellectual development consistently moves toward greater alignment with predetermined conclusions rather than enhanced capacity for independent inquiry. This consistent pattern suggests a system where truth functions primarily to maintain intellectual boundaries rather than expand understanding. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to recognize is how thoroughly religious concepts of truth have shaped Western intellectual history. The very frameworks through which we understand knowledge itself have been influenced by 2,000 years of Christianity's approach to truth, making its inversions appear natural and self-evident. rather than historically contingent and institutionally motivated. This conceptual conditioning explains why Nietzsche's analysis appears so radical. It challenges not just specific religious claims, but the fundamental frameworks through which religion has defined truth itself as something requiring submission rather than continuous questioning. The implications of Nietzsche's analysis extend far beyond academic critique of religious epistemology into the practical reality of how we relate to knowledge itself. If religious truth functions primarily to establish psychological certainty and institutional authority rather than facilitate genuine understanding, then many of our basic assumptions about spiritual and intellectual development require fundamental reconsideration. This isn't merely theoretical concern, but has profound consequences for authentic human growth beyond the constraints that institutional certainty imposes. First, we must confront what Nietzsche called the moral valorization of certainty, the possibility that religion's transformation of conviction into virtue actually obstructs genuine intellectual and spiritual development. When certainty becomes a moral achievement rather than psychological state requiring appropriate caution, intellectual integrity itself becomes spiritually suspect. This inversion creates conditions where religious formation can actively damage rather than enhance intellectual development, training believers to value conviction over accuracy, psychological comfort over genuine understanding. Recognizing this potentially harmful dynamic requires distinguishing between spiritual depth, which might actually require embracing uncertainty, and religious certainty, which often substitutes psychological security for authentic spiritual growth. The psychological implications are equally significant. If religious frameworks provide certainty by short-circuiting the questioning that genuine understanding requires, then authentic psychological development might require liberating ourselves from these frameworks rather than submitting to them more completely. Nietzsche suggested that what he called the free spirit isn't someone who replaces religious certainties with secular ones, but someone who develops comfort with uncertainty itself, the capacity to pursue understanding without the psychological crutch that premature certainty provides. This reconceived psychological maturity doesn't mean abandoning all beliefs, but holding them with appropriate tentativeness while remaining open to continuous questioning, regardless of psychological comfort. For relationship with religious institutions, the implications are particularly transformative. If institutional religion functions partly to maintain certainty, where genuine understanding would necessarily remain provisional, then authentic intellectual integrity might sometimes require challenging religious authority rather than submitting to it. This doesn't mean rejecting all religious insights, but distinguishing between perspectives that enhance understanding through continuous questioning and frameworks that provide certainty by preventing the very questioning that genuine understanding requires. The question becomes not whether to engage with religious traditions, but how to relate to them in ways that enhance, rather than obstruct, intellectual integrity. Perhaps most profound is the implication for how we understand truth itself. If religion has fundamentally inverted the relationship between questioning and understanding, transforming truth from outcome of continuous inquiry to barrier against questioning itself, then reclaiming authentic relationship with truth might require radical epistemic revision. Nietzsche suggested that what he called the new philosopher doesn't simply replace religious certainties with secular ones, but transforms the very concept of truth, recognizing it as ongoing process rather than fixed possession, as continuous questioning rather than final answer. This reconceived truth isn't relativistic abandonment of all standards, but recognition that genuine understanding develops through perpetual questioning, rather than arrival at certainty that ends questioning. This doesn't mean rejecting all religious insights, but distinguishing between elements that enhance understanding and frameworks that obstruct it by providing premature certainty. As Nietzsche wrote, "One can value spiritual insights while recognizing the psychological and institutional functions of religious truth claims." This distinction allows for appreciating religion's genuine contributions, while critically examining how its concept of truth might reflect psychological and institutional needs beyond the pursuit of accurate understanding. These implications suggest a radical but liberating possibility. What if genuine spiritual and intellectual development requires not greater certainty, but greater capacity to pursue understanding without certainty's psychological comfort. What if the path to authentic knowledge lies not through but around the very concept of truth that religion has established for 2,000 years? Why has this understanding of religious truth's psychological and institutional functions been so consistently obscured or actively suppressed? Nietzsche identified what he called the conspiracy of certainty, not necessarily conscious deception, but a multi-layered system that maintains the appearance of religious truth as ordinary knowledge, while concealing how it actually operates through fundamentally different mechanisms. This conspiracy functions through conceptual frameworks, institutional practices, and psychological dynamics that collectively prevent recognition of how religious certainty substitutes for rather than expresses genuine understanding. The conceptual dimension of this conspiracy involves what Nietzsche called the sanctification of truth itself. Religious teaching consistently presents truth not as human understanding subject to continuous revision, but as divine revelation immune to question, transforming truth from outcome of intellectual processes to gift requiring grateful acceptance. This conceptual framework serves crucial purpose, concealing how religious truth operates through fundamentally different mechanisms than ordinary knowledge. By presenting religious certainty as epistemically continuous with other forms of knowledge rather than recognizing its distinct psychological and institutional functions, this conceptual sleight of hand prevents critical examination of how religious truth actually operates. Institutionally, the maintenance of epistemic authority creates obvious advantages. Nietzsche documented how religious organizations benefit from presenting themselves as sources of certain knowledge rather than particular interpretative communities, claiming authority over truth itself rather than merely offering perspectives that remain subject to critical examination. If religious truth were widely recognized as functioning primarily for psychological security and institutional authority rather than advancing understanding through continuous questioning, these institutions would lose their privileged epistemic status. This institutional self-protection helps explain why perspectives exposing religion's unique approach to truth are so consistently marginalized or misinterpreted. The psychological dimension of the conspiracy operates through what Nietzsche called the valorization of certainty. He observed how religious frameworks consistently transform psychological conviction into moral achievement, making certainty itself virtuous, rather than recognizing its potential intellectual dangers. This psychological conditioning creates powerful resistance to examining how religious truth functions, as questioning certainty becomes not intellectual integrity, but moral failing. By establishing certainty as spiritual virtue rather than potential epistemic vice, religious frameworks effectively prevent the very questioning that might reveal their distinctive epistemic operations. Educational systems within religious contexts further reinforce this conspiracy. Nietzsche observed how religious education consistently presents doctrines as knowledge claims comparable to other forms of understanding, while exempting them from the methodological scrutiny applied to all other knowledge domains. This educational double standard creates individuals capable of applying critical thinking to every subject except religion itself, producing what Nietzsche called the compartmentalized mind, where normal epistemic standards apply everywhere except religious truth claims. This educational pattern effectively prevents recognition of how religious certainty functions differently from other forms of human knowledge. Perhaps most insidious is what Nietzsche called the moralization of epistemology. By transforming intellectual positions into moral stances, religious frameworks make questioning their truth claims not merely intellectual disagreement, but moral transgression. This moralization serves specific function, protecting religious certainties from the critical examination applied to other knowledge claims by making such examination itself appear morally suspect. When intellectual questioning becomes sin rather than epistemic virtue, religious truth gains unique immunity from the very processes through which humans normally distinguish accurate from inaccurate understanding. The result is a comprehensive system that maintains the appearance of religious truth as ordinary knowledge, while concealing its fundamentally different psychological and institutional functions. This conspiracy persists not primarily through conscious deception, but through interlocking conceptual, institutional, psychological, and educational mechanisms that collectively prevent recognition of how religious certainty operates as substitute for rather than expression of genuine understanding. The most disturbing aspect of Nietzsche's analysis isn't just its implication that religious truth functions differently from ordinary knowledge, but the systematic ways this understanding has been actively misrepresented whenever it appears. His analysis of this misrepresentation revealed not just disagreement with his position, but specific immune response that operates whenever religion's distinctive truth mechanisms are exposed. This pattern appears with remarkable consistency across different theological traditions and historical periods, suggesting not random resistance, but predictable reaction to perspective that threatens religion's fundamental self-understanding. The primary mechanism for this misrepresentation has been what Nietzsche called the epistemic attack. When philosophers, historians, or cultural critics suggest that religious truth might function primarily for psychological and institutional purposes rather than ordinary knowledge advancement, their perspectives are routinely categorized not as intellectual positions, but as moral failures, expressions of pride, rebellion, or spiritual blindness, rather than potentially valid analyses of how religious truth operates. Nietzsche documented how consistently his own work suffered this fate. Critics portraying his analysis of religious truth mechanisms not as serious intellectual position, but as expression of moral corruption. This ad hominem approach effectively prevents engagement with the substance of the analysis by focusing attention on the supposed moral deficiency of the analyst rather than the content of their analysis. This epistemic attack serves specific function. It maintains religion's immunity from methodological examination by making such examination itself appear morally suspect. By positioning analysis of religious truth mechanisms as spiritual rebellion rather than intellectual inquiry, this interpretive move creates conditions where religious epistemology cannot be examined without appearing to commit moral transgression. This defensive categorization makes religious truth uniquely resistant to methodological analysis, a perfect self-protecting system where the act of questioning how religious certainty functions becomes evidence of the questioner's moral inadequacy rather than potential insight into religion's distinctive epistemology. Theological authorities reinforce this misrepresentation through selective interpretation of texts examining religion's approach to truth. Nietzsche analyzed how passages suggesting religious truth might function differently from ordinary knowledge were consistently reinterpreted as attacks on truth itself, rather than analyses of truth's different operations in religious contexts. When he distinguished between knowledge developed through continuous questioning and certainty maintained by preventing questioning, theologians portrayed this as nihilistic rejection of all truth, rather than recognition of different truth mechanisms. When he identified how religious certainty often substitutes for, rather than expresses, genuine understanding, religious readers interpreted this as attack on the possibility of knowledge rather than analysis of how religious frameworks transform the relationship between questioning and understanding. This selective interpretation creates impression that methodological analysis of religious truth mechanisms necessarily stems from moral corruption rather than intellectual integrity. Institutional mechanisms further enforce this misrepresentation. Nietzsche observed how religious organizations consistently position perspectives, questioning their distinctive epistemology, as threats requiring condemnation rather than analyses deserving consideration. Suggesting that religious truth might function primarily for psychological and institutional purposes typically triggers institutional immune responses, theological refutation, character questioning, or exclusion from legitimate discourse. These institutional reactions effectively discourage open examination of religion's distinctive epistemology by making such examination professionally and socially dangerous within religious contexts. Cultural reinforcement extends this misrepresentation beyond formal religious settings. Nietzsche documented how artistic depictions, popular representations, and cultural narratives consistently portray questioning religious certainty as expressing moral corruption rather than intellectual integrity. Films, novels, and popular discourse typically depict such questioning not as methodological analysis, but as spiritual rebellion, a pattern that creates background cultural assumption that examination of religious truth mechanisms necessarily stems from moral failing regardless of the actual content of the analysis. This cultural framing makes recognizing religion's distinctive epistemology appear like spiritual failure rather than intellectual insight, regardless of the actual merits of the analysis. Perhaps most troubling was what Nietzsche called the silencing of recognition. He collected numerous accounts of individuals who recognized through direct personal insight how religious certainty often functioned as substitute for rather than expression of genuine understanding. Yet when they attempted to articulate this recognition, they were systematically reinterpreted by religious authorities, their insights about religion's distinctive epistemology attributed to spiritual immaturity, pride, or lack of proper theological understanding, rather than potentially valid perception. This created conditions where direct insight that might challenge religion's epistemic self-presentation was effectively excluded from legitimate discourse, maintaining the illusion that religious truth functions like other forms of human knowledge rather than through distinctive psychological and institutional mechanisms. This multi-layered misrepresentation has resulted in what Nietzsche termed the great epistemic forgetting, a collective inability to recognize how religious truth operates through fundamentally different mechanisms than ordinary human knowledge. This forgetting persists not because Nietzsche's analysis is particularly obscure or invalid, but because recognizing religion's distinctive epistemology would require fundamental reconsideration of its claims to authority, a reconsideration with implications too threatening for many religious institutions and individuals to seriously entertain. The final question isn't whether religious teachings provide meaning and comfort. They undeniably do. But whether their approach to truth fundamentally inverts the relationship between questioning and understanding that characterizes genuine knowledge development. Nietzsche's revolutionary insight wasn't that religious claims are necessarily false, but that religion's very concept of truth transforms certainty from outcome of continuous inquiry into substitute for the inquiry itself, creating a system where conviction precedes and prevents rather than follows from rigorous questioning. This requires a fundamental shift in how we understand intellectual integrity itself. Rather than measuring truthfulness by degree of certainty, we might evaluate it by willingness to question even our most cherished convictions, recognizing that genuine understanding develops not through arriving at final answers, but through maintaining continuous questioning regardless of psychological comfort or institutional approval. This reconceived intellectual virtue isn't relativistic rejection of all standards, but recognition that truth emerges through ongoing process rather than final possession, through the courage to pursue understanding without certainty's psychological comfort, rather than the willingness to accept certainty that ends questioning prematurely. The practical implications are transformative. Instead of seeking spiritual growth through deeper adherence to established doctrines, you might cultivate what Nietzsche called the intellectual conscience, the commitment to questioning that prioritizes understanding over comfort, accuracy over certainty, and intellectual integrity over institutional approval. This doesn't mean rejecting all religious insights, but distinguishing between perspectives that enhance understanding through continuous questioning and frameworks that provide certainty by preventing the very questioning that genuine understanding requires. The question shifts from, "What must I believe?" to, "How can I relate to knowledge itself in ways that enhance, rather than obstruct, genuine understanding?" For those who have experienced the constraining effects of religious certainty, this perspective offers revolutionary liberation. Rather than interpreting your questions as spiritual failure or moral inadequacy, you might recognize them as expressions of intellectual integrity, the natural response of genuine truth-seeking to frameworks that attempt to end questioning prematurely through appeals to authority rather than evidence. This recognition doesn't necessarily mean abandoning all religious perspectives, but developing more nuanced relationship with religious institutions, engaging their insights as perspectives deserving consideration, rather than certainties demanding submission. This understanding illuminates why certain figures throughout history have faced such intense religious condemnation despite their intellectual contributions. From Socrates to Galileo, from Darwin to modern biblical scholars, those who applied ordinary knowledge processes to domains religion claimed as beyond questioning have consistently faced not just intellectual disagreement, but moral condemnation. accused not merely of being wrong, but of being spiritually corrupt. This pattern makes sense only when we recognize how religious truth uniquely transforms intellectual positions into moral stances, making questioning itself appear as sin rather than virtue when directed toward religious certainties. The transformation extends to how we understand spiritual development itself. If religious certainty often functions as psychological substitute for the continuous questioning that genuine understanding requires, then authentic spiritual growth might involve not greater doctrinal adherence, but greater comfort with uncertainty itself, the capacity to pursue meaning and purpose without requiring the psychological security that premature certainty provides. This reconceived spiritual maturity isn't faithless skepticism, but recognition that genuine faith might involve trusting the questioning process itself, rather than clinging to answers that prevent questioning from continuing. For religious institutions, this perspective presents both challenge and opportunity. The challenge involves acknowledging how claims to absolute certainty often serve psychological and institutional functions beyond the pursuit of understanding, providing comfort and stability through means that can actually obstruct intellectual integrity. This doesn't mean abandoning all truth claims, but distinguishing between perspectives offered for consideration and certainties imposed to end questioning. The opportunity lies in the possibility of more authentic relationship with truth itself, one that enhances understanding through continuous questioning rather than providing psychological comfort by preventing questioning prematurely. The invitation is clear. Rather than measuring your intellectual and spiritual development by the certainty you maintain, you might evaluate it by your capacity to pursue understanding without certainty's psychological comfort, to question even your most cherished convictions, not because you value doubt itself, but because you recognize that genuine understanding develops through continuous questioning rather than arrival at final answers. This isn't rejecting all religious insights, but liberating them from frameworks that transform truth from outcome of questioning into barrier against the very questioning that genuine understanding requires. Will you continue measuring truth by the certainty it provides and the authorities who endorse it? Or will you have the courage to recognize that genuine understanding might require comfort with uncertainty itself, the willingness to pursue truth through continuous questioning rather than accepting certainties that end questioning prematurely? The greatest heresy isn't denying the Church's truth, but recognizing that absolute truth as the Church conceives it doesn't exist, that genuine understanding develops not through arriving at final answers, but through maintaining continuous questioning, regardless of psychological comfort or institutional approval. The path to intellectual and spiritual authenticity might require not greater certainty but greater comfort with the uncertainty that genuine understanding necessarily involves.